WLRN Video presents.
Hello, WLRN listeners, and thank you for returning to another extended interview. Thistle Pedersen, WLRN founding member, welcomes Renée Gerlich back to the WLRN airways. Renée is a feminist author based in New Zealand. Her book, Out of the Fog, on politics, feminism, and coming alive, was published by Spinifex Press in 2022. In 2021, Renée founded Dragon Cloud Press to publish her brief complete herstory series, a potted history of the world from the Big Bang to the present day from a female-centered perspective. Available at dragoncloudpress.com. You can hear Thistle interview Renée about the brief complete herstory via the WLRN archives, or by simply clicking the link in the top right-hand corner of your screen. Enjoy the interview, sisters.
Hey, welcome to WLRN's Airwaves. I am here today with Renée Gerlich, and it's really wonderful to be here with you, Renée, to celebrate the release of your book. Congratulations, and thank you for being here. There it is. Yes. Beautiful cover. Maybe later on we can talk about that too. We didn't have that in our plan, but the cover is striking. But before we dive into the interview, I wanted to thank you for giving me personally a shout out in your book, and also for mentioning how we met in 2016 in California at the first Wolf Fest. That gathering was a turning point for me too, and meeting you and Mary Lou Singleton influenced me a lot and strengthened my resolve to carry on. So something I notice really consistently in your work is that you acknowledge other women and give a nod to other women and thinkers. You're really very wide open to hearing and observing everything that's around you and seeing its significance and processing it and documenting it, and analyzing and taking seriously what we say to each other in women-only political spaces. And so thank you for being a writer that does that is documenting our conversations and acknowledging other women and their influence on you and contributions. So with that, I can begin with my first question if you're ready, but welcome, Renée.
Thank you so much, Thistle. I'm very moved by hearing you say all those things, and would love to throw back at you a congratulations on your album, Spinning and Weaving, and also just echo what you've said, because I feel like you've done similar things in your music of documenting and reflecting women's experiences. And I found myself when I was listening, you've got tracks like Wolf and the one For My Name, that I felt like I was hearing reflections of experiences that aren't often captured in music. So yeah, so likewise to you, and thank you also for your work, and congratulations as well. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's dive in and start talking about your book. Can you tell us why you wrote the book and what audience you had in mind when you wrote it?
Yeah, so the dedication in the book actually is to the confused and longing. But part of the reason I dedicated the book to the quote unquote confused and longing is because I've done that classic thing of writing for my younger self. And the opening chapter of the book really goes into that. And it's almost like a memoir, which I never planned to do, but it was at some point I actually brought a bunch of rough drafts and notes and plans for two different manuscripts this local person who is working as a book coach, which is a cool job title. And she looked at everything and told me that it was missing my own experiences and my own voice, which I felt really confronted by, because I had been wanting to write something that was much more kind of analytical and objective. But I found that when I took her advice, which I could feel was true, that to make the book more engaging, I really needed to put my own human self into it. And so when I started to do that, all these notes and drafts for these two different manuscripts started to fall into place and come together as one manuscript, which, opens with the story of how I grew up feeling like I was living inside of this dense fog, and how frustrating it was to feel as if life was somehow taking place on the other side of this fog. And that the fog expressed itself as for me internally as all kinds of questions about the absurdity of the culture that we live in, and also the things that really pained me. So I start off by talking about some of the first things that really shocked me as a child that might have eventually led to my own politicization, and that was the images of children, generally and often and largely African children, on the television, who were suffering from famine. So images of emaciated, very small children on the television were some of the first images that really shocked me about the state of the world. And then seeing those and being really driven to find out why are children starving in the world, and then going to school or going about my day and seeing that people aren't really, I'm seeing this emergency all the time on the television, but in everyday life it doesn't exist. There's no emergency, and I have to do things like maths problems in class and then be assessed about how well I do these maths problems. And this is so much cognitive dissonance and discord and incongruence. And then I entered the political left eventually, so I kind of talk about how that happened. And it started to kind of help me to formulate clearer questions and to answer some of them. And then eventually I start reading feminism, and that's when, that has a really dramatic impact on lifting some of this fog around me. And so that made me want to then look back and write for, those who are still trapped in this fog, particularly in today's political climate, where I think things are only getting more confusing. And I think especially young people are constantly bombarded with a never-ending, stream of high stakes political issues
that often are contradictory too, which is the confusion that you're referring to.
So that would lead me into a summary of the book, which I could go into.
Yes, please. I love that first chapter, and I'm really glad that who was it that recommended that you put more of yourself into the book?
Someone who is working as a book coach local to me. I won't say her name just because I'm not sure if she would be comfortable with that. But yeah, it was a very kind of classic and confronting moment to have someone tell me, Renée, you need to put yourself into your own work. I think that many creators recognize, that kind of moment. But she was right, and that's what.
Yeah, it helped. I can't imagine the book without that first chapter. It sets the tone. I mean, you are present throughout the entire thing because you did that first chapter.
Yeah, it makes it relatable, and it offers some context, as to why I've drawn certain conclusions, and even if, somebody might disagree with certain conclusions that I draw, you can clearly see how they arose. And but ultimately the book is not a memoir. It's not about me. It is, if I've been trying to work on my elevator pitch, and I would say it's a survey of the political landscape at present. And it's in particular an assessment of the progressive or liberal left, and the positions that the progressive left tends to adopt on all the high stakes issues that we're being presented with at the moment in the media, from Black Lives Matter to climate change to gun violence to COVID. And what I argue in the book is that contradiction characterizes the progressive left to the extent that it's not just an incidental problem that can be sorted out. It's a feature of the progressive left, not a bug, so to speak. And so a big part of my book is to explain or to articulate why contradiction is a feature of the progressive left. And part of the way that I do that actually is just to outline what these different political traditions that are so familiar to us actually are. So conservatism, liberalism, what is the left? I outline briefly the history of each, but also argue that what characterizes each of these traditions is not their values. This is a big part of the arguments that I make in my book, is that politics is not driven by values. Politics is driven by identification. So each political paradigm exists in order to defend the interests of a particular group. And so when I then argue how we might go about resolving the contradictions within the political landscape, within the progressive left, I say that this requires taking rape as seriously as we take any other issue, and looking at how the rape epidemic, how rape culture, what implications that has for everything else that we're concerned about, and what implication it has for shaping not only our culture, but our conditioning. And it requires feminism to do this, and not pop feminism, not the mainstream identity driven and actually quite fetishistic, quote unquote feminism, which is really just liberalism for women. So in other words, liberal misogyny.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that a lot of gender critical feminism is actually the real liberal feminism, because it is a combination of liberal values, free speech, and, trying to redeem certain political parties, reformism plus feminism, But oftentimes what's called liberal feminism is in fact liberal misogyny. So I'm not talking about that. And I'm also not talking about feminism as ideology, but simply the practice of, feminism to me is simply the insistence on two facts. Women are female, women are human, in a world that denies those facts. And beginning with those facts, women are female, women are human, kind of means that women start finding voices, can speak out. Based on women speaking, patterns arise, patterns that speak about, our experiences within this culture. From those patterns comes analysis, and that analysis is dynamic. It changes as the times change, is different in one country to another. So because of all of that, feminism is simply not ideological. It's not ideology. It's a practice based on women's humanity. So this practice is necessary for resolving the contradictions of the progressive left, partly because the contradictions largely arise from the fact that there's no real consistent position on rape and no real consistent understanding of the implications on us of living in a rape culture. So some of the issues, so that's probably my, that's a pretty big nutshell.
It is. It's a huge nutshell. And
yes.
I love how you visibilize feminism and weave it into the book and make it a praxis, something that you do, and to resolve these contradictions in the left. And because I'm working in feminism is my thing. In reading the book, the problem of rape, how do we get the left to see the problem of rape? I've spoken with leftists who say, well, women rape too, whereas I've read definitions of rape, legal definitions, that say it requires a penis in order for a rape to occur. And so then how can a woman be a rapist? And so there's just a lot of unresolved questions on the left, and misunderstandings and misconceptions of what rape is and what rape culture is on the left, which is why I like to just spend a lot of my time now away from the left and in feminism, and just with women and having conversations with women and about women's liberation. I'm wondering, do you see feminism, the practice of feminism, resolving these contradictions in the left and then making the left part of the feminist movement? Or is feminism a part of leftism? Or how do the two work together or not?
Well, yeah, I mean, I suppose the premise, or some of the premises of my book, addressing the contradictions in the progressive left, would make it appear that I'm somehow trying to change the entire left, or speak to the entire left about these problems, but I'm not trying to do that at all. And actually, in trying to write for people who feel, as I put it, confused and longing, I'm trying to address those people who actually cannot tolerate the cognitive dissonance. Like I couldn't. If things don't make sense to me, I won't speak, and I won't be able to. I can't really act until there's some clarity. So I've written my book for people who are seeking clarity, or at least would value this perspective on what clarity looks like, and who are therefore open to reading it. I'm not into trying to get through to people who don't have the ears to hear. It's absolutely not something that it's something I used to try to do. But I've learned that there's not a productive use of my time or my life. So to me, it's more about having those conversations among people who are really looking for clarity in a time that is characterized by confusion. And actually, I thought I might give you some of the examples of these contradictions and the confusion that I'm talking about, because I feel like otherwise it seems like some abstract problem that I might have invented. But if you look at the issues that are being presented to us, like in the media and so forth, these days, in the book I begin with Occupy. It so happens to be the year that I really started to politicize myself, but I did so independently while I was in teacher training. But that was also the year of the Occupy movement, and I somehow went from protesting on a university campus independently to finding myself among these liberal leftists who had been in the Occupy movement, standing for the 99%, the supermajority, in the words of Karl Marx. So that was 2011. And then following that, we've had roughly at about the same time, Black Lives Matter and the Pride Parade started. And then we've had Me Too. We've had March for Our Lives against gun violence. It was like exactly a year after the March for Our Lives march, the climate strikes took place. On the same day in New Zealand, actually, that the Christchurch massacre happened. A gunman shot 50 people in a mosque in an Islamic center in New Zealand. And then following that, of course, we're living in COVID times. We've also seen the takeover of Afghanistan by the Taliban, Russia invading Ukraine. And then in amongst that, we get all this stuff about Johnny Depp and Amber Heard and Will Smith punching Chris Rock, and what is Kanye West doing? And every time those things arise too, we're supposed to be looking at the significance of, so it's like all those issues are supposed to be representative of a wider problem that affects us all. So it's a real mass and mess of issues everywhere. But if you look at the progressive positions, for instance, Black Lives Matter, the founders of Black Lives Matter, so something that is a theme within that movement is prison abolition. If you look at the Me Too movement is very much about one of the rape cases that was in the global media that I talk about in my book, and was the Stanford rape, which I think was in 2015, where Brock Turner raped a woman behind a dumpster in Stanford, and she wrote a victim impact statement during the trial that went viral, and then ended up writing a book called Know My Name under her real name, Chanel Miller. So I draw on that book a lot in my own book. And she writes about how Brock Turner only got a 6-month prison sentence. And the injustice of that is a big part of Me Too, that rape is not taken seriously. Obviously, that rapists don't get sentences that reflect the seriousness of the violation. But of course, that doesn't reconcile easily with prison abolition. And then when you have something like COVID, where everybody is meant to be unquestioningly following these government mandates and lockdowns, it's like, okay, so 1 minute we're supposed to be questioning the state itself and state institutions as being colonial, as being racist, as being violent, in short, as being not in the public interest, but existing for some other purpose. And then the next minute, we're supposed to just take for granted that the government is operating in the public interest, and not only follow its orders, but follow its orders without question, which indicates a level of trust that is, most people don't even offer their nearest and dearest, who they've known intimately for a long time, let alone anonymous, governments and law enforcement agencies. So and then you have the domestic sphere, because when it comes to things like Black Lives Matter and Pride and everything, the narrative is kind of like, white silence is violence is one of the mantras, and we're supposed to be creating discomfort around us by raising issues at the dinner table, for instance, that might not be seen as appropriate, and sort of upsetting the status quo. But then when it comes to, again, COVID and lockdowns and everything, the big thing is, in New Zealand especially, be kind. And we're meant to be stuck at home and not leave the house, so it doesn't become a place that you really want to be upsetting people every day. And then the question also of, like, with Pride and BLM, and some other issues, and on the progressive left in general, there tends to be an idea that violence can be justified. But again, in COVID times with Be Kind, it's like you feel a bit more micromanaged, like even coming within 2 meters of somebody or not wearing a face mask can be seen as kind of a threatening behavior. So, it's like that's the mass of contradictions that characterize the political left and that I was trying to analyze and diagnose and attempt to resolve in my book. Yeah, for the sake of people who can't deal with all that cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, definitely. So then in all of that, what did you discover? How did you resolve those contradictions in the book?
Well, one thing I argue is that whether you're looking at police brutality, which is what Black Lives Matter is looking at, homophobia, capitalism, which is, Occupy movement, climate change, you're looking at a problem which is rooted in male violence. So with climate change, in order to make this point clear, I draw on a writer called Barry Sanders, who has a book called The Green Zone on the environmental impacts of militarism. And he argues, and I quote him in my book, that the number one threat to the environment, to the planet, is the United States military. And he breaks this down. He uses data to show how much, fuel consumption, but not only that, abject destruction, like chemical warfare and dropping bombs. Like, how is it that, this is one of the contradictions they talk about. We had March for Our Lives talking about gun violence and gun control happening precisely almost to the day 1 year before the climate strikes and Greta Thunberg, being the kind of spokesperson to getting the children out of school and onto the streets talking about climate change. And suddenly gun violence was off the table because gun violence doesn't seem to connect very clearly to the issue of climate change. So we, rather than gun violence, the most pressing problem we face is that we're living through the 6th mass extinction. But militarism is the commonality there. Militarism rooted in masculinity, because masculinity is the name for the gender norm, which encourages men and enables men to become violators, to be interested in dominance, to be able to numb themselves enough to kill people who they have no personal grievance with. And to talk about that, I draw on Kathleen Barry. So she has a book called Unmaking War, Remaking Men, and also talks about how misogyny is central to masculinity, disidentifying from women, refusing to be like a woman, which starts in the school playground. So I quote Leah Keith as well. She says, the worst insult that a boy at school can ever receive is that he's like a girl. Mm-hmm. So this distancing from females, distancing from girls and women, and defining yourself as something other than that is masculinity. And that is a driving force of male violence, militarism, and therefore climate change, but also police brutality, rape that is discussed in Me Too, mass shootings, yeah, all of it. So to quote Caitlin Roper, male violence is the worst problem in the world.
Yeah.
Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, like, regardless of anyone's position on that, I don't know the details of their intimate lives, but once you understand this pattern, those sorts of incidences become a little clearer to navigate as well. The Will Smith, Chris Rock, these were like random examples of things that I used that kind of add to the general mass of issues and confusion. But all of this stuff starts to conform to quite a clear pattern once you can see the issue of male violence. And in a way, it surrounds us so much that we don't see it like fish don't see water in some sense. And then it looks as if all these issues are very separate, and that's partly what enables us to have contradictory positions every time something new arises. But male violence is the key problem. And a friend of mine actually did something interesting when he read my book. He went through my index to find what the most quoted terms were, like which were the terms with the most page numbers. I found it really interesting because I hadn't thought to do that, but he said the two words I use the most often are pornography and identification, which would be another way of summarizing my book. So socialization to masculinity is what creates this identification with male dominance. And then when women learned, and I write about my own experience of having to go through this and having to navigate this, when women then learn to do the complementary thing of identifying with the male gaze and try to conform to the male gaze, that's how identification gets into our own minds. And this is gender. This is a primary form of socialization and conditioning, and I would even argue pain and trauma, that we have in the world. And even best-selling authors like Brené Brown and Elizabeth Gilbert, who are quite in the kind of self-help world as people who are very well read and not seen as particularly threatening. And even they identify gender as being at the heart of our pain and anxiety and depression and disconnection and all of those things that are often talked about, mental health, talked about these days. And one thing I argue, which is just a feminist argument, is that rape is the act that sustains the status quo. And that also is obviously a very real assertion of male dominance and power over women specifically. But it's also symbolic in the sense that rape is violation for gratification and control. If you look at what is capitalism, what is environmental destruction, what is militarism, one country invading another, rape is... I mean, I have a whole passage in my book about how a lot of feminists don't like rape being used in the abstract or as a metaphor, and how I honor that. Like I can see why, but how also in a rape culture you can't not look at the abstract dimension and say, well, when this act is fundamental to sustaining in particular patriarchal system, that is going to express itself in kind of macrocosmic ways as well. So this act is kind of what characterizes also social conditioning, like the invasion of one's mind for somebody else's gratification and for control. So that's my argument, that until we look at this issue, we really can't deal with anything else, and that this issue of rape and male violence is at the heart of everything else we're trying to address. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a truth that so many don't want to acknowledge. And like you said, the fish can't see the water that it's swimming in. And I think rape culture is it's obvious to me, and to you it's just everywhere. And pornography is I think boys are 9 years old on average when they first see pornography now in today's world. I mean, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, but yet when we're talking about climate change activism or stopping mass shootings and things like that, gun violence laws, people don't see the connection to this core issue of male violence and rape culture and the threat of rape that has conditioned every woman, even if you haven't experienced it personally. And and like you're saying, like that act, that threat is also on the larger level, informing foreign policy and how we view other nations. And it's really goes to the core of how our society is organized, but yet so many are blind to it and not willing to face it. And and like you said, is it our job to try to make others face that truth, or what is our job? Our job is to have good lives, right? And live well, and do the best that we can to have this conversation. And also, what is our job, Renee? Like, what do you think we should, of us who are coming out of the fog and coming alive, what is it that we should be doing in the face of this world of contradictions, where so many are in the fog still? What is it that we should be doing, those of us who are coming alive?
Well, this is another theme of my book as well, because obviously, as we talked about, the first chapter is something like a memoir, just to provide context for the analysis. But in writing a personal account, I've also, incidentally and on purpose, have written an account of me trying to grapple with this question of what do I do? How do I respond? And by the end of the book, that question for me is resolved as much as it is possible to resolve. And the way I've resolved it is by learning some important lessons from some key painful and pivotal moments in my life. So I used to be somebody who believed in this thing called accountability, and I still do. But it means, when you think someone is getting away with something only because the culture, the people can't see it because, the fish in water phenomenon, you kind of have a job to point to that thing and make noise about it so that there can be some kind of accountability, if that makes sense. So when you see, for instance, a politician promoting transgenderism quietly but openly, that, for instance, over here, the Green Party is obviously doing that the most, and there are certain politicians. Feminists tend to go after the ones who are the most vocal, which tend to be women, because, it's the spokespeople for women who are having to bear this job of talking about how trans women are women and so forth. Mm-hmm. But then in the background, you'll have these male politicians who endorse the idea but don't get criticized or questioned for it so much. And I would sort of be like, you need to be held accountable, and try to make noise around that. And I guess I reached a point in, because so initially that was kind of my idea of what to do. You try to seek accountability. And I guess I reached a point where I saw in myself some belief that I was responsible for, I guess, fixing the world, because that's the implication, right? Like, if it's my job to hold all of these people to account, I'm almost, it's funny because as I talk about it, it's like, on the one hand, I can see the validity still of that perspective, and on the other hand, it's embarrassingly grandiose. So, and it also, it's conditioning as well, this idea that you have a moral duty to fix the world. It's like it's conditioned belief. It's not a natural truth. So once I started to recognize that, I started to look for an alternative, and there are many people now who are talking about this concept of responsibility, the word responsibility being able to be split in two, and how responsibility doesn't imply moral obligation. It doesn't imply blame or fault. Like if you have a responsibility for something, it doesn't mean it's your fault that it, exists. But it means that you have the ability to respond. And that's how I have resolved that question of what to do is, okay, I have one life. This is the world that I see. I have the ability to respond. How do I choose to do that? And in that sense, responsibility is roughly synonymous with creativity. So the question is, how do I use my creativity in this world? How do I choose to do that? Yeah, and that is, one of the themes of my book is contrasting authentic power and external power, drawing on many authors who have made the same distinction. And I would say that this idea of creativity or responsibility is at the heart of what authentic power is. So activating that and employing that in a way that's true to your own integrity has been what I've learned is all that we can do. And in fact, I kind of have been criticized of being too individualistic in having that notion, because it doesn't sit comfortably with the idea of collective change. When you are no longer trying to create change in the external world and you're instead asking yourself, how do you harness your own creativity? It's kind of a very individual question. But in fact, I believe that if you envisage or can imagine movements that are created not out of committee meetings and adherence to particular, group policies or objectives or things like that, if you imagine how movements could be created out of individuals wanting to harness their own creativity, spotting the people around them who are the best collaborators for them, either in the long term or for particular projects, and then eventually patterns emerging and groups emerging who are created out of this phenomenon of different individuals activating their creativity to respond to the world. That's the kind of movement that I'm interested in.
You are listening to WLRN.
And, I think that's also part of our conditioning as women to think that we don't deserve personal individual happiness and fulfillment, that we always need to be working for the collective and working for the community and for that for people outside of ourselves. And if we pay attention to ourselves and our individual self, that somehow that's selfish and individualistic and not, caring enough. And yet I feel like I like the vision that you are outlining right now. It's like a true collective is made up of members that are individuals that have had the opportunity to develop themselves and to find out who they are and what excites them, and to work on projects and to be creative and to be to use their ability to respond, and from a calm place and a centered and grounded place that's enjoyable. That was the other thing that I noticed in your book about how as we as individuals can come alive and find that authentic power, that there's enjoyment and that there's happiness involved with that. And so often I feel like when it comes to the world and the world's problems and how to resolve them, and also, or not resolve them necessarily, but to come to an acceptance that you can't, completely heal the world. There's like a phase where you might feel guilty that you get to do creative projects while there's suffering in the world, and you're not focusing on trying to solve that suffering anymore. You're focused on the opportunity that you have as an individual to be creative. But really, we wish that for everyone. We want everyone to have the opportunity to become an individual. This actually really reminds me of the philosophy of preschool teaching that I am attracted to. Instead of treating everyone the same, which would maybe be like a collectivist approach, or like a community approach or something, where everybody has the same uniform. We tell the same stories to the children because they're universal and everybody can relate to these stories. All the same toys in the classrooms. Everything is the same. You treat everyone the same, and the individual really just doesn't. It's the group. The group is what's important and not the individual. Well, I don't like that. I feel like the group is important, but the group is made up of individuals, and the group is stronger when each of the people in that group are able to find out who they are, express who they are, and enjoy the diversity of all of the different individuals that are making up the group, instead of everybody being treated the same. And so, I don't feel like they're mutually exclusive. To focus on the individual and the authentic power of the individual isn't necessarily meaning that you can't focus on individuals coming together and being collaborative and working as a collective and having power that way.
To me as well, the individual's capacity to be with themselves alone is
alone, or maybe with one cat.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, the individual's capacity to be alone and in their solitude,
is so key and definitive to the health of a group. And I kind of want to propose something here that I don't really go into explicitly in my book, but that's been sort of my perception or my observation of groups and also of feminism, is that when we politicize, or when we encounter a kind of political analysis that is really illuminating for us, that makes us go, oh my gosh, like I understand more now. I kind of can see how this pattern is played out in my life. I can see in the external world, like how this is playing out. I feel so much clearer. That intellectual experience is it can be visceral as well. It's not purely intellectual. It can be really liberating, but it doesn't automatically translate into us being relieved of a lifetime of conditioned patterns and conditioned habits and beliefs. So, this is exemplified in the left, where, being aware of capitalism and racism and so forth doesn't automatically shed men either of patterns of, male bias or male entitlement. And likewise, becoming feminists in terms of our analysis doesn't shed women of a lifetime of habits of codependency and needing the validation of the other in order to feel okay within ourselves. So my own observations have been like kind of my theory about what happens when women first come to feminism, start reading feminism, start engaging with feminism, and then enter a group, is that the first thing that might happen is that we start to become less needing of male approval. But the underlying codependency isn't gone. So the first thing that happens is that it transfers onto the feminist group. So the validation that we used to require from an individual man, we now require from a group, because it takes a lot for somebody to be able to go without the validation and approval that you've been needing and looking for all your life, that need is culturally conditioned. It's not something that we wanted and invented and have cultivated or within ourselves. It comes from having long-standing unmet needs because of the way that society and the culture is structured. Like, it's not our fault that we have these habits, and they don't automatically go away. There are processes that we need to go through in order to address some of these issues within ourselves. So to me, I think that is something that happens, and that it's really natural for that to happen, for us to transfer what was originally a kind of a search for Mr. Right or whatever, or a need for male approval, into a desire and a need to be recognized by other women in feminist groups, or within feminism. And I think this is actually what's that?
Well, I just wanted to interrupt you because that reminds me of the question that I wanted to ask you, which is, we are sort of hardwired to need that kind of social approval and recognition because we're so social. And so why are you calling it a codependency rather than like an interdependency? Like, human beings exist in a group. Our ancestors were tribal. We influence each other. We're so profoundly social. Isn't it part of our nature to need recognition and approval and love from our peers?
Well, that's a really big question, but I think which does lead me down a different track, so I can take that invitation. So I'll leave what I was saying and
I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, that's okay. I'm just acknowledging. But we'll probably come back around. But
okay, let's come back around. Okay.
But I do discuss in the book the process of socialization, and I draw on multiple authors to do this. One I draw on in particular is Gabor Mate, and my views are very much aligned with his. He emphasizes medicine, the medical establishment, cultural ideas about how to respond to illness, as that's his emphasis in his work when he talks about how sick our culture is and how it makes people sick. He emphasizes medicine, and because that's his background. I actually think that my work and my ideas are very similar to his, but my emphasis is on sex and sexuality, and then also rape, pornography, and sexual relations, rather than medicine. So the question of socialization and feelings of alienation and the need to be able to stand on your own in the world to a degree, I would say also there's a lot of promotion at the moment that Gabor Mate is doing for his new book, The Myth of Normal. So turning to that book or his other books, or listening to him speak on those issues, would be something I would recommend. But one thing that him and thinkers like him talk about is how human beings, when we're born, we are particularly dependent and vulnerable in comparison to other animals. And so in the first, say, 3 years of our lives, especially, abandonment is lethal.
Mm-hmm.
And our nervous systems are programmed in relationship to the people around us. So our brains develop along in ways that are informed by the patterns, the nervous systems of our mothers in particular, and those around us. And so one thing I say that and argue in my book is that I believe that in a culture that wasn't sick like ours, human beings would grow out of our perception that abandonment is lethal, or that social, not having validation or approval is lethal, around the same time that this stops being physiologically true. If, a baby can stress itself to death like if a baby gets overstressed because there's no one around, it can't self-soothe, it can stress itself to death. That's not true for an adult. We can emotionally self-regulate. But another quote that I have from my book is something like that a patriarchal culture doesn't allow us to grow out of our childhood dependency.
Yeah.
It leverages that dependency instead to promote conformity. So what we have is that we go into adulthood with a sense that if these people don't approve of me, or if I lose these particular connections, or if I lose this kind of social status even, or social approval, it's going to feel like death to me. And like I've see this pattern in my own life where, say, the end of a breakup, of a romantic relationship, for a long time, I never quite understood why this cut me as deeply as it did. It felt like dying. Even the threat of a romantic relationship ending could feel devastating as some kind of terminal diagnosis. Like,
Yeah.
but I never understood quite. I did and I didn't understand why I had that emotional response for a long time. And I think it comes down to this, that is actually a childhood association between abandonment and death that we are not supported to mature out of, because that's not what this culture does. It conditions us rather than supporting us into maturity. And I think being supported into maturity would do two things. First of all, it would allow us to be an individual in relation to the group, and to deal with the challenges and the joys that come with that. And secondly, it would allow us more to come to grips with mortality and the fact that we are only on this earth for a brief moment, and so, I mean, I think that I don't know that we would necessarily experience the kind of dread that comes with, the threat of, or the reality of being rejected by a group that we make and can experience in this culture, which is also evidenced, that other people are experiencing this dread when you look at the level of cognitive dissonance that they will tolerate in order to stay with the group. Like the whole trans women are women thing, I'm saying nobody believes that. Everybody knows that biology is real. And I often use the argument that trans activists themselves will often say, hey, this man, they won't call him a man, but this man needs to have state-funded genital surgery in order to have an imitation vagina installed in him so that he can be a real woman. And this is kind of like a perverse kind of concession that biology is real. A woman has a vagina, therefore to be a real woman, this man needs to have an imitation vagina. I mean, it's weird, but it's an acknowledgement of biology. So even these people know it's real.
Right.
No one believes that a man can be a woman. But the roots of that very idea come from, first of all, the fact that we are just emotionally in need of the group, that it come from our dependency and the fact we're not allowed to mature out of it in a system based on the accumulation of artificial forms of power. Yeah. And there was something else I was going to say, but I'm talking so much, I'm losing track of my own thoughts.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's so much there. Your book is just filled with layer after layer of meaning, and drawing on all these different thinkers and making arguments. So I can see, teasing it all out. And something that's coming to mind is I can't cite a source, but I know I've heard, it's pop psychology or pop anthropology maybe, that the worst thing you can do to a human being is to shun them and banish them from the group. And is that nature or is that nurture? that characteristic of being a human being. And I think you're saying that if we didn't live in this culture that encourages women to be subordinates and men to be dominant, and that, you know, doesn't allow us to mature out of that initial dependency, that physical dependency, that, you know, maybe banishment from the group, rejection from the group wouldn't be so harmful to us, you know. But
No. I don't think that's what I would say. I don't think that we need to strive to be invincible, or that a healthy person is invincible in that way. I don't think a healthy culture goes around shunning people.
right, okay, good.
And in fact, if they do, so I have this idea as well, and I think it's echoed by other thinkers like Brené Brown. Brené Brown talks a lot about shame, and she says that shame is, and I agree, that shame is, it's social in nature. It's not necessarily an emotion in and of itself. It's an understanding that that people outside of you reject something, and it's almost a preempting of, there's something about you that's not accepted and you have to kind of cover it up. It's a social phenomenon, shame. And I almost have this idea that a culture can decide what they're going to do with this phenomenon, that rejection and ostracization is, you know, and shame are within our capacity, you know. And I feel that I mean, I talk in my book about what I understand are human origins. I talk about what a matriarchal culture is, and I say that I believe it is best summarized as a culture in which children grow up learning to take care of their mother's homelands.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that's where we come from. And I believe in a culture like that, we see ourselves as belonging to one another and belonging to the earth. And it's therefore antithetical to the culture and to the spirit of it to shun people. However, I think if our capacity to kind of use shame was to be sensibly deployed, I think it would be against people who show evidence of being pedophiles.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think there's every reason to make the group out of bounds for men who demonstrate that they have an interest in sexually abusing children. So I think that one of the problems in our culture is that it actually, on that note, this is controversial. I never use the word cancel culture. I never ever use the word cancel culture. I do feel very much cancelled in my country. I don't even know how to promote my book in this country because I can't get access to any platform or outlet or anything. So I could be lamenting cancel culture, but I feel that I don't, because I'm someone who's interested in social change, which also means being interested in some things being cancelled. So I can't really claim that I don't want anything to be cancelled. I'd like capitalism to be cancelled. I'd like patriarchy to be cancelled. There will be a lot of platforms that will come down with that. So I'm not really concerned about things being cancelled. It's just, I have a particular outlook. So from this perspective, the wrong things are being cancelled. Right. And I think it should be, it should be perpetrators, and people whose behavior and indicates that they might be perpetrators,
Right. That makes
who could and should be cancelled within a sane society that cares about life.
Right.
So
using that tool of shame and banishment from the group in this ideal society that's matrifocal, the matriarchy that you talk about in the book, to banish those that would threaten that and that would be pedophiles and harmful to children in the group and ultimately to the group. And who cares then if they have a hard time and it's the worst thing that's ever happened to them in their life, because we're caring about the group and the health of the group and the health of the society, and we're keeping those harmful elements out, and male perpetrators out in this ideal scenario that doesn't exist. So, you know, but if it could, then yeah, that I see what you're saying, how shame could be used and canceling could be used as a tool. So
yeah, I guess the point of me saying all of that as well, I mean, I don't have any particular arguments or ideas about how to, you know, what an ideal, I mean, I'm not, like, I consider myself an anarchist, but I'm not an activist who holds this kind of blueprint of the ideal society that I believe that we should all agree upon and work toward. Like, I think some, you know, socialists and Marxists kind of do that. I don't do that. So it's not like I have this model in my head of this is how we do this and this is how we punish these people. You know, and that's all very,
yeah, we're just speculating
anyway.
You're
But
much
it's, you
more
know, when
creative
you, yeah, and when you ask and talk about that phenomenon of feeling isolated or being isolated and left alone, and how it goes against our instincts and needs as social animals, I mean, those are just my responses to that. Is like, first of all, in a healthy culture, I don't think we go around ostracizing people, but if we did, this is how we might, you know, this is what it might look like, or, you know,
right, but this isn't a blueprint.
maybe what even this capacity for shame that we have might even be for. I don't know, but yeah.
Okay, well, yeah, thank you for clarifying that. And then I wanted to talk to you. This is for me because lately we've been organizing a lot of free speech for women events in the United States. And, you know, of course, Kelly J. Keene is also organizing Speaker's Corner events to take back the public square for women and women's voices. But yet in patriarchy, advocating for free speech may actually backfire and harm women. And you write that neither the concept of free speech nor hate speech laws are designed to protect women in this society. So how can women organizing feminist actions like Speakers Corners, for example, or free speech for women events, take this into consideration while also attempting to take back the town square for women's silenced speech?
I think I'm going to interpret that as a general question about free speech, which I have a lot to say about.
I knew you would.
And I first of all want to acknowledge that. I mean, I will go into that because I think free speech is something that is commonly, you know, it's like cancel culture, like it's a phrase that is used all the time these days because it seems like the obvious thing to promote in a culture where a lot of people are silenced and a lot of what I would consider the wrong people are silenced, as in people who haven't displayed any evidence of being threatening at all to the well-being of others. You know, there's no reason to silence somebody who thinks that biology is real. Yeah.
I'll point
if we're saying, yeah.
Right.
So yeah, it seems that the obvious thing to do is to promote free speech. The first thing I'll say before I get into kind of a breakdown of this topic is that I believe that women often promote free speech when what they really seem to be meaning to do is to object to discrimination. So for instance, liberal institutions, there are a lot of liberal institutions that are founded on the principle of free speech, like for instance, a library. Because free speech is a liberal idea. So liberal institutions, you know, have this at their, whether or not I agree with it, free speech as a principle or think that it makes any sense. My main problem with it is that I don't think it has meaning. I think it's a very vague concept. But anyway, if the library claims to hold this value highly, and then it goes and cancels women for believing in real facts, like I know it has happened to, someone like Megan Murphy has been, I think at some point banned from a library in Vancouver or something like that. The question then is discrimination. So they have this value that they claim applies to all people, but they're withholding a service, access to the library, from a group of people who haven't done anything wrong. Like, I think, so that's, if that happened to me, then what I would do is not promote free speech in the face of being banned. I would just say this is an act of discrimination.
Okay.
Because whereas this platform might be open to anyone else, they're refusing to allow me onto it. That's discrimination. And I think that happens a lot, that feminists advocate for free speech when they're actually, what seems more appropriate is to object to the discrimination that is taking place. And part of the reason I think we should think about this and think a little bit more about whether it's sensible for us to promote free speech, my ideas about that kind of roughly form into two, I guess, categories. So, because free speech can first of all be considered in the abstract, like as a value in its own right. So there's that famous quote, I think is often attributed to like Voltaire, but maybe wasn't his quote, I'm not sure, where it's like something about how, even if I detest everything that you're saying, I will still defend to the death your right to say it, that quote.
Yeah, I've heard that quote, but I don't know. Yeah.
So that's kind of like the essence of free speech in the abstract as a value that some people might hold.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's also free speech that is promoted more specifically as it expresses in legislation. So like the First Amendment. So my problem with free speech is with both. And it's also just a visceral, when I hear the phrase free speech, I've never used it because it just doesn't make sense to me. It to me implies a kind of mind-body disconnect that is very odd and weird. So how could I conceive of my speech being free if I'm not? Or why would I think that people who don't have my best interests at heart will still care about what I'm saying? You know what I mean? It's like, it's just never made sense to me, but I'll go into why that is a little more. First of all, drawing on Andrea Dawkins, which I do in my book. So I use Dawkins' critique of free speech and the First Amendment. So she talks about three main problems with the First Amendment. One of them, the first one, is she points out that the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, which is the free speech amendment, she says it doesn't grant you a voice where you didn't have one before. It doesn't give you the right to a voice in public. And she kind of makes this joke about how, if it did that, I would be able to say, hey, I've got something important to say. Give me 15 minutes on, I don't know, primetime news or whatever. I want to like cash in on my free speech quota. It doesn't do that. So the point is actually to protect people who already have a platform. And the reason why this is important to feminists is because feminist speech and women's speech is all about people who have been relegated to the private sphere, or relegated as sex objects, but relegated to the private sphere, the domestic sphere, which is by definition, it's the sphere that is the corollary to the public sphere. So it is exactly what is not the public sphere. So moving people who are relegated to the private sphere into the public sphere, in other words, granting women a voice, an ability to speak, is the purpose, part of the purpose of feminism, and it is really what feminism is. Consciousness raising groups in the 1970s, 60s and 70s, 80s were about women coming together and voicing things that were supposed to be private, supposed to stay in the private sphere, supposed to not be voiced. A lot of women's pain is about what happens to us in through the vehicle of our sexuality, sexual assault, rape, like talking about these things together, talking about how we've been socialized to accept these things for ourselves in groups allows us to, as I said before, like see the patterns. But this is bringing what is supposed to be private into the public. It's fundamental to women's speech. And the First Amendment has absolutely nothing to do with that at all. It doesn't allow for that, enable that, or support that practice at all. The second thing that Andrea Dawkins points out is that she says the First Amendment, in her words, doesn't stop a man from punching you out for what you said. I might actually have the rest of that quote. She said it doesn't stop anybody from deciding you're an uppity bitch because of what you say, and that they're going to hurt you because you said something that they didn't like. It doesn't stop anybody from using economic recriminations against you for what you say. So, I mean, when I started writing my blog, I write about this in my book. When I started writing my blog, I was subjected to an online pact that was signed by somewhere around 200 people in the region where I live, the wider region where I live, who were basically declaring their intention to ensure that I wouldn't have financial support, study opportunities, or speaking opportunities. That's what it said in the pact. Like, Renée Gerlich is dangerous, she shouldn't have these things. And then it was signed by somewhere between 150 and 200 people, something like that. And they found out where I worked. They put pressure on my employer. I had to quit because it was a very small team. Basically became impossible to stay there. If that happened to me in the United States, what the First Amendment it has nothing to do, it is not going to help me. And for me, like promoting free speech, I didn't have a platform really. I mean, I had a blog that I made for myself, but I wasn't in a university. I wasn't publishing somewhere. I didn't have a platform that was taken away from me. What happened to me is that I have been in my country prevented from ever gaining one, which means that I'm basically irrelevant to the question of free speech because I don't have a platform to defend in the first place, which a lot of women don't. So it doesn't prevent people from basically insisting that you stay in the private sphere and that your words don't come out. It doesn't prevent people from making sure of that. The last thing that Andrea Dawkins points out that I think is very profound that she points out about the problem with free speech and the First Amendment is what she calls the repulsion standard arises from it. So she says that it's a pattern within free speech advocacy that we point to the most repulsive political agent in the room, or, in the metaphorical room, and we defend their right to speak. And I've seen feminists do this, but I've also seen feminists who are free speechers being put in the position to do this time and time again, where they will promote free speech and someone who's challenging them will say, well, then what do you think about this awful person? And then they'll be pushed into a corner to say, well, I think that is crazy, but I think people have the right to say crazy things. Personally, I think that it represents a huge departure from anybody's political integrity and objectives to start advocating for the right to say crazy things. I mean, that such a thing doesn't exist as far as I'm aware at the heart of any liberation movement. I'm not here to promote the right to say crazy things. It's a random, as soon as you start hearing yourself say stuff like that, that you've been distracted from what it is that you really care about. And free speech does that. It's a major distraction because it has you advocating for your political opponents And when I say that, I don't mean we all need to stay in these divided camps. I just mean that if you're a feminist and what you're concerned about is, for instance, a world without rape, which is a beautiful vision, there's no need to then start saying, oh, Donald Trump shouldn't have had his Twitter account taken away from him. I mean, you don't even need to go there. It has absolutely nothing to do with the vision of a world without rape. It's not that you need to see other people as their enemy, but you don't need to get tangled up in their unimportant supposed struggles over platforms that who cares anyway. I would rather that, we're meant to be seeing, and this is again still connected to the issue of actually free speech in the abstract, because when you take free speech in the abstract, it's no longer just about governments not being able to silence people who have platforms, but it becomes about, say, even a private company like Twitter, removing people or deleting people. But if you start objecting to that kind of thing, then you have to kind of accept the idea that that the public square, we're meant to see Twitter and social media as the new public square. But if you do that, you're kind of accepting that the public square is now privatized and corporatized. Twitter is a corporate entity. I don't really accept the idea that Twitter is the public, I mean, to then start demanding your rights from a private corporation is a very odd thing to me, because capitalism doesn't work that way. And also, I think, I'll wrap up soon, but looking at, not just the legislative aspect of free speech where governments are prevented from silencing people with platforms, but looking at the abstract where it becomes about civil discourse and people saying, hey, if I let you speak, you let me speak, we need to agree to disagree, whatever, then the concept becomes even more vague. And one thing I've noticed is that the state of protest itself starts to become very ambiguous. So let's say I wanted to have a real life book launch, which is something that I haven't done and haven't managed to even think about how I might do in this country. But let's say I did it. I approached a bookshop and I promoted and said, hey, I'm gonna promote this book which talks about the progressive left and transgenderism and how it's all wrapped up together. And I think that it would be quite inevitable that a bunch of green-haired activists would show up and try to raise hell. Now, from an abstract free speech perspective, should I say that by protesting my book launch, they're interfering with my right to speak? Or if I called law enforcement, like police or something, to take them away, am I interfering with their right to speak? And if I start looking at protest as something that goes against free speech, what does that mean if I then want to protest? And again, I'm not saying any and every protest needs to be defended, but I'm just saying that free speech is not a useful way of understanding what's going on in that situation. And I would never employ the idea of free speech in order to problematize what's happening if I tried to talk about the political landscape and people try to stop me by harassing me, basically. I think that leads to the last kind of thing that I would want to suggest about free speech, is that I think that when we see the world, the political climate as it is today in terms of cancel culture and free speech, there are three phenomena that get conflated very often. One of them is the kind of backlash that inevitably happens anytime people assert themselves in just in life. Like, if you've ever read classic folk tales and kind of heroes' journeys like the Odyssey, as an individual begins to become an individual within a group or independent of a group or a family, inevitably resistance happens, and part of individuation is dealing with that resistance. And I think that that's one form of resistance that people can face when they are trying to speak authentically or from the heart, or even just differentiate themselves as people. Another time that you can receive backlash for speaking is if you're being obscene. And a third time that you might typically receive backlash for speaking is if you're telling a truth that people don't want to hear because it goes against the group, it goes against what's required of people at the moment for social approval. So there's three different very common typical instances where someone might speak and receive backlash as part of the process of individuation, when they're being obscene, and when they're speaking truth to power. And I think that those three are all being conflated at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the promotion of the concept of free speech and even the term cancel culture encourage us to not only conflate those three things, but kind of not even necessarily always see the differences. So then everybody claims to be speaking truth to power.
Right.
As soon as you start receiving backlash, you start going, oh, that's because I'm speaking truth to power. Whereas the backlash could actually just be something that everyone goes through when they're differentiating themselves. It could be because you're being obscene. Sometimes people who are being obscene get this kind of puff their chests out and they go, people don't like it because I'm just saying, like Eminem.
Yeah.
I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking, I'm just telling the truth. And that's why I get all this backlash. Well, in my view, you're just being obscene. And that's why you're getting all this backlash. You know what I mean? There's a combination. But I think the distinction between those three is quite significant in politics. And I think that
we shouldn't lump
worth
them all
keeping
together,
in
but
mind.
yet they do, like, just to give you an example, here in Madison, they are all lumped together. It's like the free speech of the trans activists who are ostracized, who are harassing us and may even be posing a violent threat. At one of our Speakers Corner events, a woman who was working the camera was assaulted. I mean, she was hit by a trans activist, and yet the state sees their right to free speech and their right to protest our demonstration as a protected right. They even will go so far as to say that those emergency sirens on the megaphones that they're using in a non-emergency situation, they're just using them to make a bunch of noise so that we can't be heard, that's protected free speech.
Yeah. And that's another thing that I actually mention in my book, is that the words themselves are so vague and poorly defined, ill-defined when they come together. Free and speech. They're so vague that ultimately in politics this concept can be used as a vehicle to promote anyone and everyone's interests, and it can be changeable. So like we have a libertarian political party leader here in New Zealand, David Seymour, who he will work with the gender critical feminists and help them have events in the name of quote unquote free speech. I mean, I believe that he's being somewhat opportunistic because there aren't any other political parties who are doing that kind of thing. So he can grab that kind of uncatered to demographic of women who believe in biology, which I think is probably a pretty large demographic. And at the same time, he has stood up for the rights to free speech of people who call themselves pro-life, who harass women at abortion clinics as they actually are coming in and out of abortion clinics. So, with the pro-life signs and anti-abortion, so-called activists. It's one thing as well to state your view, and another thing to actually go where people are vulnerable and receiving a service at a hospital and coming in and out, and that's harassment.
Right.
So if you decide that, okay, in this moment I'm going to promote so-called free speech by reframing harassment as a form of speech, what you're doing there is you're not actually promoting any kind of abstract value at all. You're just demonstrating which party you are more aligned with in that moment. Because, what if I was coming out of that clinic and I told those people to fuck off and leave me alone? Is he then going to defend me as well? And in which case, what an unproductive line of political fight to even take on. If you're going to stand in an argument and defend both parties because of speech, to me that just is such, I'm like, why would you do that? Either you want change in the world and you have an idea of why you want that change, what it would look like to you. So for me, that's the vision of a world without rape, and you work to that end, or you really have no idea and you can just promote free speech.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't lead anywhere. It just, you can, as I said, promote anything and everything with that phrase. Yeah.
And that indeed is what's happening with the First Amendment here in the US, it seems. And so, but thank you for clarifying that's, and explaining all of that's really helpful. I don't know if we'll change our wording based on this conversation. We do have a hashtag that's free speech for women that we're using for our organizing, and but you're giving me a lot of things to think about, and I'd like to discuss this topic with my co-organizers and see if we might come up with some other slogan.
Well, to me personally, even identifying whose speech you're interested in is helpful, because it turns something that is extraordinarily vague into something that has some objective attached to it. If you say free speech for women and you're about amplifying women's voices in a world that seeks to silence them, that is something that is a lot more clear than just advocating for free speech as a concept or as a supposed value, which actually has no real worth.
Yeah.
So,
then maybe it's enough to say free speech for women, as opposed to saying free speech in general. We are very specifically talking about women being able to air our concerns, participate in society, have our voices heard. Very specifically, that's what this project is focused on. So, but yeah, I've definitely been seeing how the concept of free speech is used to justify harassing us at our free speech events.
Yeah.
So yeah, that doesn't make sense. So, but it does in patriarchy, right? And I just want to thank you again so much for coming on to WLRN's airwaves and providing us, our listeners and followers, with the first interview you've done about your new book. It's a fantastic book. I hope lots and lots of women read it and have conversations about it. It certainly is a great springboard for conversations. So well researched, and it's just a joy to talk to you, Renée. So thanks again.
Thank you very much, Thistle.
Hope you enjoyed that chat between Thistle Pedersen and Renée Gerlich. If you like what you are hearing and would like to donate to the cause of feminist community radio, please visit our WordPress site, which will be linked in the description, and click on the donate button. Check out our merch tab to get a nice gift in exchange for your donation. And if you're interested in joining our team, we are always looking for new volunteers to conduct interviews, write blog posts, post to our Facebook and other social media pages, and we would really like someone interested in producing our stellar podcasts. This is April now, WLRN Canadian member and proud member of the only national organization in Canada dedicated to preserving the rights and protections of women and girls, CAUSEBAR. I'm hoping you all stay radical, sisters.